Hello and welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for ethical risk, bias, and effective governance. I'm joined once again by Jeffery Recker, our COO, and this is part two of our discussion on where to start with the EU AI Act. How's it going, Jeffrey? First.
It's going pretty well. Probably let the audience know we're keeping everyone on their toes. We're in different clothes. Your camera is a little different. This is definitely a different day because we get quite busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, super excited to dive into this a little more. I got a bunch of questions, and we'll see how deep we go. I guess for a little bit of info on those that might just jump straight into this episode, there is another episode, obviously, talking about the first half of questions that we have, covering like primary objectives of the EU AI Act and what specifics, um, particular aspects of the AI Act and AI systems will require conformity assessments and frequency of that and some other things. But going forward, I'll just jump straight back into it and start with my next question, if that's all right.
Yeah. Let it rip.
So, next question: what documentation and transparency measures are required to demonstrate compliance, and how can businesses effectively maintain and update these records?
Oh, yeah. So there's going to be a lot of documentation required. So the primary thing is you need to have a really well documented quality management system, and there's a whole and also technical documentation, which has got its own article and an annex describing the technical documentation about your system, your AI system, and the governance. These are the primary documents that will be assessed by a conformity assessment body for you to go through your conformity assessment if you're in high risk and if you need to have a third party go through it. As of now, there are a bunch of systems which are considered high risk, and we talked about this last time, that can go through sort of an internal, they just basically have a declaration of conformity. They do it themselves, but they have to have all these documents in case anybody asks. It needs to be there. So those are the big ones for conformity. However, in order to be compliant with the act, there's all sorts of other documentation that you need, and in particular, all the way along the value chain of AI, and in particular between a provider and a deployer. Which last time we talked about, the provider is considered the one who is providing the AI and selling it in the European Union, and the deployer is the one who's using it. So the provider has to give the deployer instructions of use, and those instructions, and there's very specific directions for that, and the deployer has to actually comply with those directions of use. So that's going to be, in my opinion, one of the toughest things for people. Not toughest, I'd say it's one of the first things that people need to think about. If you're a provider, how are we going to provide the right documentation for our clients? Because that's where they're going to first start feeling the pressure. The clients are going to start asking for it. And so it's going to take putting together a really clear description of how your tool works, how it's, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, how should it be used, and based on the risk assessment you've done, what shouldn't you do with it? That's probably the most important thing, and that has to be provided to the deployer, and with instructions like that you don't do this or you should do that. Those things are going to be kind of the top documentation. There's also in the technical documentation. There's logging and of the system and demonstration of post-market monitoring. But those are really the big things.
So I'll ask a follow up, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not, but this seems like a daunting task. And, there's such a spectrum when it comes to companies. I think sometimes when you think company, you think this large, complex enterprise. But there's such a wide spectrum of companies out there producing and using these tools. And I'm curious, like, the differences or in the challenges you see for like a small, medium-sized company with maybe 100 and 200 employees versus one of these larger thousands of employees, global presence. Do you speak to that at all?
Yeah. So in some sense, the complexity scales with the size of the organization and the amount of AI that it's either providing or deploying. However, so do the resources. So it seems like the small fish have are going to have a hard time because of the lack of resources, but they'll also have fewer things they're going to need to worry about because they might only have one AI system, like major AI system that's considered high risk, and they can have a small team put together their risk management framework and their quality management framework and get all of the pieces in place that you need. Whereas a large organization, we've talked to many that don't even know where the AI is being used yet. Like there's not like a robust inventory of where all the AI is hiding, because most large organizations and even smaller ones actually nowadays are going to be both simultaneously providers and deployers. And so there's going to be obligations that will depend on the AI system. And so almost everybody, you have to know which systems you have. And so we've mentioned this on the podcast before. The very first, one of the very first things you need to do is actually get an inventory and know which systems you have or deploy or in development. And then you have to have a triage process where you're categorizing them as this might be high risk, this is probably a low minimal risk, this might be prohibited. Probably not too many people will fall into that category. Um, so large organizations are going to have their hands full just organizing where everything is. And then there's some critical choices, which I've seen, which is, do we have a centralized governance for these systems? Or is it going to be more kind of federated where there's a lot of individual uh, parts of the organization that are going to handle the AI management system for each AI system? So that's a tough decision. Ideally, centralized is probably better, but there are some cases where risk assessments, for instance, might want to be done by a team that is really knows what the tool is doing. So anyway, it's a daunting task, and I think both large and small organizations are going to have their hands full in different ways.
Yeah, and probably don't be afraid to ask for help, whether that's internal or external, because I can only imagine, especially with one of these large organizations where you're on multiple continents, you're in dozens of countries, you have thousands of staff. You don't know where this one tool, this department over here is using this tool. If that, you might not even know another one over here exists. So it's yeah, sounds like quite a lot. And then also scope. If a tool is only being used in the US, do you need to consider it?
Yeah, I mean that's a very people are wrestling with that now, trying to make decisions about do they invest in compliance if they're, let's say, primarily working in the U.S. Is it worth it to deploy in Europe at this moment if they have to go through all of these compliance hurdles? I think most companies that we've talked to are deciding to go for global compliance, even the smaller ones, to really put in place those systems that are going to be adhere to the most stringent, which at this moment is EU AI Act. Because even in Colorado, they've passed their own little version of the EU. Little, I wouldn't say little. It's going to come out before the EU, and it is much more focused on discrimination, but it still has all of these components. And there's going to be a lot that companies have to do, so they might as well really focus on that and not limit themselves in terms of jurisdiction.
Yeah, yeah. I'll add to that a little bit too. So I talk to companies every single day from a sales perspective, and where their pain points are and what they're considering, and that is like a weighing option, right? So it's like, do we look at global or do we look at where we're at right now? And I think there's a desire to kind of caution and wait to see how this global market emerges and how you're affected. But honestly, the EU AI Act is so large and it covers so many boxes. If you're doing the EU AI Act, you're likely covering most of the things with all these other laws. And if you think you can kind of avoid the EU because you don't have clients in the EU or whatever it is, you got the Colorado uh, AI Consumer Protection Act. Canada is considering things. You got stuff in, Japan, Australia is looking at stuff. So pretty much every continent is considering something. Um, so it's inevitable. So it's kind of like how do you want to where do you want to start and what's your approach going forward? I would say at the very least, look at from a high level what the EU is doing and try and start implementing those things now because it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our audit clients for New York are sort of, some of them are inching their way towards the EU, and we put that audit together knowing that the EU AI Act was coming, and which is why we have, let's say, risk and governance requirements that are not required by New York. But we knew that it's good practice to start putting those things in place, having something on paper, at least saying we have a committee that's going to govern this. We've done basic risk assessments, and now that's the nucleus around which you can build. And that's all you need right now, because the fact of the matter is, it's going to be about a year. CENLAC will come out with more standards around what needs to get done, and so you don't have to wait until then, but you do want to be ready for when those standards come out.
And that's a good segue to my next question is how will the EU AI Act be enforced and which bodies are responsible for its oversight and implementation?
Yeah, so that's a tough one to answer. I mean, for some people, maybe it's easy to answer, but an outside perspective, so basically, the idea is that it's going to be national bodies, national median EU state bodies. So there'll be a Spanish enforcement agency, there'll be a one in the Netherlands, so on and so forth. Those, it's unclear. Each country has to figure out which agency, which organization is going to do it. I think there's some thought that the data protection bodies, which kind of enforce GDPR, are going to take that role. It's not clear. Now, the AI office has formed, and the AI office is supposed to sort of facilitate a lot of this. But um, a lot of those bodies have not been formed yet, and so it's going to be a waiting game. I think though it won't be a waiting game in terms, like, once the once the obligations come into force, I'm thinking they're going to move very fast to start enforcing that regulation. But there's still, in the next, let's say, 6 months to a year, we're going to see a lot of these organizations coalescing in the states, in the European states, and start, preparing themselves for enforcement.
So, as a non EU person listening to this, does that change or add complexity to this law, knowing that there's different governing bodies per country you're in?
Yeah, for sure it does, because I mean, at the end of the day, the EUA Act is a uniform law, right? And it's written. You can look at it and try to comply with it, but there will be differences between the different countries in terms of how they try to enforce that. And just like with GDPR, some countries were more keen, like Ireland, for instance, were much more keen to start enforcing GDPR than some of the other European countries. And so it does add you do have to keep an eye out for what's happening, where are enforcement actions happening, and in which country, and make sure that you've got the ship sort of everything tightened up around the law in those countries. But it's a global law and it's all written, and so in theory, you should be able to get yourself into conformity, and it should work across the entire union. But the problem is you're going to get fined. It's pretty easy to get fairly big fines if you mess something up.
So, on that note, what are the biggest challenges you foresee in complying with the EU AI Act? Or can you even speak to that?
Yeah, that's gonna. I mean, this is just guessing on my part. Well, I know of certain challenges. It's like certain articles of the law are difficult. Um, so things like getting the infrastructure for logging things in the right way, post-market monitoring. So some of the technical stuff, post-market monitoring, making sure that you're monitoring the system after it's deployed. Um, some of the accuracy, robustness, validity, like Article 15, those are tough because those are technical measures. You have to make sure they're in place and make sure that you're measuring the right things. The risk assessment, which is Article 9, and for deployers who are like state bodies, like public bodies, like city governments and things, have to do fundamental rights impact assessments. Both Article 9 and those fundamental rights impact assessments for deployers are difficult. People haven't really done those type very much. Like our organization has done it, and we require our auditees to do it. So we have a lot of experience in it. We've published sort of methodology to do it, but most average risk assessment methodologies for enterprise risk management are not that outwardly focused. And even the European Commission criticized ISO 42001, which has a fairly robust risk assessment and impact assessment methodology within it, saying that it was not good enough. And so I think they're going to be kind of tough on those aspects of the law. So there are certain challenges there. I would say in the short term, one of the biggest short term challenges I see is simply getting a very good layperson description of what a provider's AI system actually does. We see this all the time with like you have to spend a lot of time trying to boil down exactly how your system works, what data it uses, and explain that in a way that the deployer can fully understand, because that's part of the law. You have to have that there. And that's a challenge. Just, that's one of many challenges, but that is going to be a challenge.
And honestly, it's uh, I shouldn't caution to say this, but it's also it's a fun thought experiment. Like we get so used to technology. Like I say this outside of the context of the EU, just in general. Like we get so used with new technology coming into our lives all the time. There's always a new app. There's always a new feature. There's always some new tool. But often you never, especially when it comes to AI, which is kind of a completely different monster than traditional software. Um, you kind of don't think about how it's coming to those decisions, right? So, like, how does ChatGPT come up with that question or that answer or that essay, or how does Midjourney come up with that image? And it's kind of like a fun thought experiment to do on your own, and you'd be surprised how few people ever consider like, how is this tool actually working? Um, I will say to the first part of that, there are a lot of really useful tools that are emerging to kind of help with these things. A lot of platforms out there to help you with a lot of the technical stuff. A lot of good tools. Like we partner with a number of companies, but a lot of this is just a simple Google search. So there are some resources out there to kind of help you with this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's a good segue in my next question, which is what resources or support mechanisms are being provided to businesses to help them comply with the new regulation? Now, this question, I think, is saying like what's coming from the EU, but maybe in a broader sense, you can answer this and help some people out.
Yeah. So I think coming from like the European Commission and now the AI office is providing information. So they've done a webinar. They're starting to do webinars, for instance, right? Uh, there was a webinar, and so that information about ISO 42001 being not perfectly matching with the quality management system came from one of their webinars, right? So they're going to ramp up this sort of outreach and trying to communicate information to um, organizations. Some national bodies are going to be or are starting sandboxes. And so a sandbox is basically a company you have to get in line because a lot of companies want to do it. They basically can work side by side with regulators, the enforcers in the particular country, to try to comply with the EU AI Act a little bit early, where there's a little bit of safe haven, where even if you're not perfect, then it's okay because you're going early. Those sandboxes, if you can get into them, are probably going to be a very attractive option for getting direct help from the commission or the enforcement bodies. And then there's more information coming from the European Commission. So, like I said, the European Commission asked CENELAC, which is like the European sort of standards bodies, jointly standards bodies, to come up with technical standards around a bunch of things like risk assessment and some of the accuracy and robustness stuff I was talking about. Those are supposed to come out around April 2025. We'll see if the deadline gets pushed. That's going to be very useful information that could be used. And also, about 6 months before the enforcement deadline of the high risk systems, the European Commission should produce guidelines and examples on how do you categorize high risk versus minimal risk, let's say. And that's also going to be unfortunately, you only get 6 month window. And so probably you should have categorized it yourself ahead of time, but that's useful. And then in the broader sense, I'll go quickly away from the European Commission. Of course, this is going to be a big business. This already is starting to be a big business. And there are a lot of companies like BABL, which are available to help. And there are platforms that are basically like GRC platforms that are tailored to these laws. And for the EU AI Act, a lot of them will have the EU AI Act right in the platform, where if you need to comply, you can start uploading documents. And we partner with some of these organizations as well to be auditors. Let's say if you needed to be audited and you were on that platform, and so there's plenty of people out there to help. But the important thing is you got to start now. And if you haven't gotten a copy of the act and haven't read it yourself, that's step number one, because it's worth it to actually look at the details.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. Like, to your point, there's a ton of resources out there. There's non-for-profits doing quite a lot of stuff. You can always go to consulting firms. BABL can help, but not just BABL. There's tons of firms out there. A lot of people are specializing in this. A lot of law firms are out there helping people navigate this. Like you said, a lot of platforms, but also tons of free resources. And I'll kind of just shout us out. We produce a ton of free resources. Lunchtime BABLing is the start, but we have a news channel that publishes news updates almost daily for all global AI regulations and governance. And our blog goes in pretty good detail on a lot of this law and other laws. And we're now producing a whole bunch of downloadable content, like PDFs that'll be up on our website soon, that'll help you walk you through, what steps to take and all of that. So there's tons of free stuff out there as well. So you just kind of got to know where to find it, who to trust. But there's help out there for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
My next question: how does the EU AI Act balance the need for regulation with the need to foster innovation and competitiveness in the AI sector?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's several ways they're trying to do this. It remains to be seen how successful they are, but they do have exemptions for certain things for small and medium-sized enterprises or like startups. They have research or R&D exemptions for some of these things, so you can have a system. You can work on a system which would be, if it were deployed, classified as high risk, and not have to comply with all of these things if it's just in the R&D phase. And so that's or used like in universities or developed in universities, for instance. So that's try to keep the innovation going without really imposing or stifling it with these requirements. They also, some of the sandboxes, I think, are another attempt at for them to be like, hey, come work with us to comply, so it's not so much of a burden on you. I think that's another example where they're trying to encourage innovation. I mean, my personal opinion is we've seen the AI hype cycle happen. Right now, there's tons of articles talking about how it's coming, it's crashing. Right, the bubble is bursting a little bit on AI, and I think we're entering a new phase where just having a AI is not sexy anymore, and trying to stuff AI into everything is not that useful. And so we're gonna find that I think there are companies that will focus on making AI trustworthy and safe as a priority, like to spend an equal amount of time saying we're going to dedicate ourselves to having the right kind of guardrails, the right kind of processes in place to build trust. That's going to drive innovation because there's a huge amount of innovation around that safety component of constraining these models to get them to behave the way you want them to behave and to give reliable, consistent, truthful information. And there's a lot of innovation there. And so if I'm a startup right now working in the AI space, I would bank on the fact that if spending time on that trust and safety part is going to pay dividends later. So be innovative there and don't try to just be fancy or flashy with the newest model. Just say, given the model I have right now, how can I make it trustworthy and safe? I think that's innovation, and I think that will pay off in the long run.
All right. My next question would be, what are the penalties for non-compliance, and how will they be determined and applied?
Oh my God. So it's a lot. And I might have to look some of these up. So the one that I know off the top of my head is the lowest one, which is the minimum is 7 million euros for providing wrong or misleading information to either the European Commission or the conformity assessment body or to like one of the national authorities.
Let me ask a question on that.
Yep.
But so you say wrong, misleading information. What about ignorance? What if you do something unknowingly?
Well, that's going to depend it's probably going to depend on the enforcement agency, the body that's doing the enforcing. Now, they do say that some of the considerations, they say explicitly in the act that considerations for this penalty include things like your intention, how rigorous you were. It's not the same words as that, but it boils down to were you operating in good faith to actually comply, right? So if you were, likely that there's going to be some leniency there. But there are some things where it's like ignorance is no excuse. If it's in the law and you didn't do it, the law is there for everybody to read. They're giving you 2 years or 18 months or so now to read it and to comply. And there's sandboxes and all this information, everything we've been talking about. And so I don't think they're necessarily going to feel super sorry for people if they really mislead or put something that was very black on white in the text of the act, and they don't do it correctly. So this is a risk for us as a auditing and the conformity assessment body as well. Like we have to provide the right kind of information. We have to make sure that we're auditing and checking the homework of all of these companies. And the companies themselves have to be careful about how they categorize. So if they say they have a quality management system, and then it turns out they don't actually have a quality management system, or it isn't as robust as they said it was, that's 7 million euro, right? If they say they log their information and they actually didn't log information over some months or something, and they misled the commission about that, 7 million euro. So it adds up quickly if those things happen. And that's not even if you have a high risk system which is not compliant. then that's something like 30 million. I can't remember the actual numbers. I can look it up and put it in the show notes. But it's significant, and the question is, how hard is it to avoid that? It's probably going to be kind of hard because I think most people, for instance, are not compliant with GDPR. Right. The question is how quickly will you get caught? And it's going to be a ripple effect. The big organizations are going to be the lowest hanging fruit and the biggest fish. Look at Twitter, or X now is under the Digital Services Act, is getting fined. And so because it's a big fish and it has lots of money. And so smaller companies may be able to get away with it early on, but I wouldn't count on it. It's a very risky thing to bank on.
Yeah, and it depending on your organization too, it probably echoes the need for external expertise and guidance, or at least checks, to go through and make sure you have done anything, that you haven't missed, nothing's gone through the cracks, because it is a massive, massive regulation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we do gap analysis. It's really like an audit, but it's to audit your current standing against the EU AI Act, and we give a report about where all the gaps are and areas that need to be filled in. But you need those sorts of things, and you don't have to get it from Babel. I don't want to sound like I'm selling, but like there will be a number of people who are offering those. But you getting the extra pair of eyes is going to be important because most internal teams are overworked. They're already worried about a number of other regulations, and it just is good practice to get some other opinion uh, on how they're doing before the deadline.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say this too. We've mentioned our services a few times now. Like, anyone, go to anyone for help. It doesn't need to be Babel, but it can definitely help you out, depending on your confidence with this. There's, like I said, tons of resources out there. A lot of people in the space, that are here to help you. So a lot of, your general counsel, your legal, whoever it may be, just don't be afraid to ask for help, because, as you pointed out, Shay, the fines are, it's not something to mess around with.
Yeah. Well, I'll also caution too that there are a lot of people saying they know what they're doing who also don't know what they're doing, right? So,
Fair point.
for instance, like when we go talk to people about doing putting together a quality management system or risk management system, we say that from a place where we've done risk assessments and impact assessments for algorithmic systems, and we have audited dozens of companies' risk management systems and quality management systems for AI, not for like cybersecurity or some other thing, like very specifically AI. So not everybody's going to have that level of experience. There are plenty of people who do, but you do need to be careful, like to find people who don't just sort of know the act on paper, but they actually have done some work in this area. And that's one thing that I like. I'm always skeptical, and just make sure you kind of read up on what people have done, because everybody's talking about it now because it is going to be a big business, as you just make sure that people have actually done something in this space.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity cost for just millions of people. I tell people all the time, this is going to mirror GDPR, and it's going to mirror ESG reporting. Like, there's a huge industry there. I just didn't want to, keep saying, like, this isn't an advertisement. You do what makes sense for you. But to your point, Shay, like, I've seen people come to me last year for help, and then they went with just some random cheap consultant, and now they're coming back this year,
Yeah.
and that person didn't know enough. So it's not about necessarily just anyone, but to your point, like, vet these people. If you contact us, for instance, just scrutinize us all you want. Like, ask all of the challenging questions. Um, and again, if it's not us, go to someone you trust. Always start with your legal. That's always a really good benchmark.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but not every organization has, a team of lawyers at their, beck and call. So, um,
Yeah, yeah. Startups are really. I mean, we get unfortunately calls from startups that sometimes they just don't have the resources. We can't help them
Yep.
really. And when you're resource constrained, but you have a startup in a high risk AI, which a lot of them are now in sort of like hiring space or in ed tech or um, fintech, those sorts of they're squarely in high risk, but they're also startups, which are and that those are the people who uh, you have to be careful who you get, and you make sure that you find somebody that you trust to help, because it's tough when you don't have the resources.
Yeah, and honestly, that kind of echoes an earlier question in terms of fostering innovation. Like I've seen companies reach out to us with under 10 employees with help. If it's not EU, it's New York Local Law 144, for instance, with these hiring algorithms where they want to pivot because they're unsure of the legal landscape ahead and how they can navigate that. So and in that regard, like I'm kind of proud with how much just free information we put out there, because it's a lot of it's complicated, a lot of it's complex, and we try and do our best to articulate these things clearly. And honestly, if the audience has any questions about anything, just throw it our way. We're happy to write stuff. We have a journalist on staff, Jeremy. If you follow any of our newsletter, you see his name pop up all the time. Don't be afraid to shoot him an email and ask for content on certain topics. He's always looking for things to write about. So don't be afraid to ask. We'll get through these last few questions a little quickly. What guidelines should entities follow to ensure their AI systems are human centric and trustworthy?
Oh my God. I think the
No
easy
small questions.
so just follow the letter of the law. Yeah, just follow the letter of the law. So in terms of the human centric, I think one thing that when you're building these systems, it's very easy to get caught up in like either the startup or the product mentality, where you're just looking for product market fit. You want to get something that works. You're thinking about features and stuff like that, and it's hard to pull back and think high level about what do you want to represent as a company, and what are the impacts of that system. And if you don't have high level AI principles in place, for a while there, it was all AI principles and no actual action. But still, so I've criticized them before for being sort of operationalizable. However, you do kind of need to have them, because you have to have that North Star to be like, we care about fairness, so we care about transparency. Well, what does that mean for our organization? That's what human centered means, is like you have an idea of how your socio-technical system fits in with the rest of society or the environment. And if you don't have that idea in your mind or written down somewhere that everybody can be working towards, it's not going to be human centric. It will turn out to be a product, and the people will be products, and that's not what you want. And so I think starting with those principles is a good idea. And then for all the details, the act has it all. That's where, once you have that North Star, you just start following the letter of the law and try to comply.
Awesome. So, what proactive measures can entities take to ensure their AI systems remain compliant as technology and regulations evolve? That's a good question.
Oh yes, it's just going to be tough work. I mean, part of the problem is you have to have. So one of the first things you have to do when you're kind of categorizing, or when you're doing a risk assessment of these systems, and we should have a podcast where I go through the risk assessment process. But basically, you have to identify the context of the algorithm, of the AI system. So the context is like, where is it being deployed? Who are the stakeholders? How are they interacting with it? What are the results of that? We have this whole CETA narrative that we use to sort of articulate this. CETA meaning context, input, decision, action. And in any case, that's where most of the work in terms of figuring out, is this thing high risk? What are the impacts on fundamental rights and things like that? And so you have to be monitoring that context and looking for changes in context. If you're thinking about as AI evolves and as your organization evolves, how are those contexts changing? And if do I enter a new jurisdiction? Do I have a new stakeholder or a new target audience that I'm servicing? Um, does the model change and change potentially the what type of system it is? Or do we pivot and do we go into a new vertical? And does that change the risk profile? And those are all kind of like, they're not impossible things to do, but you do need to be very deliberate about it. And you have to have a system in place, which is what the risk management and the quality management system is all about, in order to track that context, because that's the starting point. And once you realize, oh, we're in a different regime, we now have to consider new risks. And then it starts a cascade of sort of interventions and mitigations in order to stay compliant. And that's just hard work. But if you can start it and lay the foundation and the company culture around that kind of thinking, it becomes much easier to maintain over time.
Yeah, and I'll just add one last thing too. As I said a couple of times now, the EU AI Act is such a large regulation. It covers so much stuff. At least right now, it should cover 95% of any other emerging regulation. So it's a good, to your point, North Star. It's a good North Star to start with. So even if there is so much uncertainty with, in the US, for instance, we've had dozens of AI regulations proposed at both the state, the city, and the federal level. So, and then you have industry specific laws. So, like the insurance law in Colorado, for instance, there's it is a daunting task, but I do think that the EU AI Act is a good kind of start, North Star. And then, of course, as we've already said, like always start with your general counsel, your lawyers, whoever it may be, or a trusted advisor and consultant. BABL, we're on top of this 24/7, and there's lots of companies out there that are looking at AI governance and regulation. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a good start.
Yeah.
Um,
It's going to be work no matter what.
yeah, and a lot of work. And honestly, I'll say this too. I think a lot of people they hear that and it's just like, oh man, more regulations, right? But this doesn't come for no reason. It's not regulation for the sake of regulation, and a lot of these regulations are bipartisan for a reason, and that's because there's real risk out there. We can use deep fakes are a great example of how this can harm anyone, and not just any individual, but like entire institutions, right? So democracies are at risk. So there's very real risk to AI that's out there, and you have to, as a society, as the society gets more complex, our regulations gets more complex. It's just a byproduct of civilization. So we have to. Uh, these regulations are emerging and complex for a reason. So not every tool is equal, obviously, but there is some real risk out there, and you don't want to,
Yeah,
and you don't
absolutely.
want that huge lawsuit as a unintended consequence. And I tell people all the time, just do a Google search, type in AI, you use any industry, and then some phrase like racist, sexist, whatever, and then lawsuit. There's hundreds of lawsuits out there now. So this is a very proactive approach to avoid that complex flaw in the future.
Yep.
Um,
Absolutely. So
so how do you,
do we have any more questions or should we wrap it up?
last question, and then I was going to do a quick wrap up. How do you see the EU AI Act evolving in the future, and what additional measures or amendments might be necessary?
Well, we're going to get the standards from Sense and Lack, so that's an evolution in the sense we don't know. I mean, we do know we're talking to people, and so we have an idea what's coming, but um, it's going to be new stuff and new guidance. And then there are delegated acts that they can have that are in the law that they can have new delegated acts to amend certain things. like to change the risk profiles or to um, give new guidance on particular aspects of the law. And so I think it will evolve over time. We're going to see what works and what people are what companies are struggling with, what organizations are struggling with, and there's going to be new guidance. I think we're going to see this law will evolve over time. How it will evolve, we don't know, but this is all a big experiment. This is going to be quite a ride, I think, eventually.
Yeah. Well, that was awesome. That's all I have. I'm glad we put this into two parts. I think we'll upload it on the same day, part one, part two. But this is, I think, well over an hour and a half now. But I think it was a really important and valuable conversation.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps the algorithm. If you're listening to us on a podcast, thank you for listening, and we will see you again on the next Lunchtime Babbling.